I'm filing for divorce. And the baby isn't Daniel's. Those were the words my daughter-in-law whispered across my kitchen table one rainy Tuesday morning. For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard her correctly. The kettle on the stove had just begun to whistle softly, and outside the window the rain tapped against the glass like nervous fingers. I remember staring at her face, trying to read the expression there, searching for some kind of joke, some kind of misunderstanding. But Emily wasn't smiling. Her hands were trembling around the mug of tea I'd made for her, and her eyes looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Emily," I said slowly, my voice quieter than I expected. "What are you talking about?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the table, at the tiny pair of knitted baby socks I had finished the night before. They were pale blue. I had made them for my grandson, or at least, for the baby I believed was my grandson. Emily swallowed hard. "I know everyone is going to hate me," she said, "but I can't keep pretending anymore." And just like that, the ground beneath my family began to shift. 3 hours later, my son Daniel called me. He sounded like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. "Mom, did Emily come by today?" I was standing in my kitchen again, staring at the empty chair where she had been sitting earlier. "Yes," I said carefully. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then he asked the question I had been dreading. "Did she tell you?" I closed my eyes. "Yes." Another silence. And then my son, the boy I had raised alone after his father died, began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, broken kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it feels like it might never end. "She said the baby isn't mine," he whispered. "If you had met Daniel and Emily a year earlier, you would have said they were one of those couples people quietly envied. They had been married for 3 years. Daniel worked as an electrical engineer at a construction company downtown, and Emily taught 2nd grade at the elementary school just 10 minutes from our house. They weren't flashy people. They were the kind of couple who spent Saturday mornings at farmers markets and Sunday afternoons fixing little things around the house. Emily baked banana bread every other week. Daniel always mowed my lawn before I even had the chance to ask. And when they told me they were expecting a baby, I remember feeling something inside my chest expand with a kind of happiness I hadn't felt since Daniel himself was born. I was going to be a grandmother. For months, everything seemed perfect. Emily would come over on Sunday evenings with her hand resting on her growing belly, smiling shyly whenever Daniel fussed over her. "Sit down," he'd say. "Did you eat today? You shouldn't be carrying those groceries." She used to laugh at him. "Daniel, I'm pregnant, not fragile." Those evenings were warm and ordinary in the best possible way. We'd eat dinner together. Sometimes Emily would fall asleep on the couch while Daniel and I talked quietly in the kitchen. He would glance at her and smile. "I still can't believe I got this lucky," he once told me. And I believed him. I believed it too. But somewhere in those last few months of Emily's pregnancy, something had changed. At first it was so small I barely noticed. Emily stopped coming over as often. When she did visit, she seemed distracted, distant. Daniel would ask her a question and she'd take a few seconds too long to answer. Once, I caught her staring out the window during dinner, her hand pressed against her belly as if she were trying to steady herself. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. She smiled quickly. "Just tired." It was a believable answer. Pregnancy does that to people. Still, something about the way she said it stayed with me. Then the baby was born. A beautiful little boy. Daniel called me from the hospital with excitement bursting through every word. "Mom, he's perfect." I rushed there within the hour. I remember walking into that hospital room and seeing Emily lying in the bed, pale but smiling, while Daniel held the tiny bundle in his arms like he was holding the most precious thing in the world. When he placed the baby in my arms, I felt tears sting my eyes. He had dark hair and long fingers just like Daniel had when he was born. "Hello there, little man," I whispered. But when I looked up at Emily, something about her expression stopped me. She wasn't smiling the way new mothers usually do. There was love in her eyes, yes, but there was something else there too. Something heavier. Something that looked suspiciously like fear. Over the next few weeks, things only grew stranger. Emily insisted on handling most of the baby's care herself. Daniel offered constantly, but she brushed him off. "I've got it." You should rest. Go to work, Daniel. I'm fine. He thought she was just being protective. I thought so too at first. But one evening, about a month after the baby was born, Daniel came to my house looking exhausted. He sank into the chair across from me and rubbed his face with both hands. Mom, he said quietly, Emily barely talks to me anymore. I frowned. What do you mean? She won't look at me sometimes, he said. And every time I try to talk about the future, about the baby, she changes the subject. He let out a tired laugh. It's like she's already halfway out the door. I remember telling him what any mother would say. New babies are stressful. She's tired. Give her time. Daniel nodded. He wanted to believe that. We both did. But the truth was already sitting in my kitchen, waiting to be spoken. And when Emily finally said the words that rainy Tuesday morning, everything we thought we knew about our family began to unravel. Because when she told me the baby wasn't Daniel's, I didn't believe her. Not for a second. And the reason why was something that would eventually destroy the careful lies someone in our family had been hiding for years. After Daniel's call ended that afternoon, I stayed in my kitchen for a long time. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray, and the house felt unusually quiet. The kettle had gone cold on the stove. Emily's tea sat untouched where she had left it. I kept replaying her words in my mind. The baby isn't Daniel's. It didn't make sense. Not because I believed Emily incapable of making mistakes or bad choices. She was human like the rest of us. But something about the way she had said it, the way her voice had trembled, didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like a sacrifice. And that was the first thing that made my stomach twist with unease. Because people don't usually destroy their own lives, unless they're trying to protect someone else. That evening, I drove to Daniel's house. The porch light was on, but the rest of the house was dark. Daniel opened the door looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red, his shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked less like a grown man and more like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Mom, he said quietly. I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of baby powder and stale coffee. The baby, little Noah, was asleep in a bassinet in the living room. His tiny chest rose and fell gently beneath the blanket. Daniel followed my gaze. She left him, he said. My heart skipped. What do you mean? She packed a bag and left this afternoon, he said. Said she'd come back for the rest later. I stared at him. She left the baby? He nodded slowly. She said, it would be easier that way. Something inside my chest tightened. That didn't sound like Emily at all. She had carried that baby for 9 months. I had seen how she watched him sleep, how carefully she held him, how she checked his breathing every few minutes during those first days. A mother like that doesn't just walk away. Unless she believes she has to. Daniel sat heavily on the couch. I asked her if there was someone else, he said quietly. I didn't interrupt. She just shook her head, he continued. She wouldn't tell me anything. Just kept saying the same thing. He looked up at me, his voice cracking. She said the baby isn't mine. I felt the weight of those words again. Do you believe her? I asked gently. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Noah sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said. That night, after Daniel finally went to bed, I stayed awake on the couch with the baby. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock and Noah's quiet breathing. I watched his tiny face in the dim light. His nose was small and straight, his eyebrows slightly arched, and his fingers long and slender, just like Daniel's. I had raised my son from the day he was born. I had memorized every feature of his face, every small expression. And when I looked at Noah, I saw Daniel, clear as day, which meant one thing. Emily had lied. But the question that kept echoing in my mind was why. The next morning I decided to visit Emily. She had moved into a small apartment across town a year earlier, closer to the school where she taught. When she opened the door, she looked like she had aged 10 years overnight. Her hair was tied back carelessly, and dark circles framed her eyes. Hi, she said quietly. Neither of us mentioned the baby at first. I stepped inside, noticing how bare the apartment looked. No toys, no crib, no baby clothes, Just silence. Emily gestured toward the kitchen table. We sat down across from each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I leaned forward. Emily, I said gently, I know you better than that story you told yesterday. Her eyes flickered. What story? The one where you suddenly decided to destroy your marriage, I said. Her hands tightened around the mug she was holding. You don't understand. Then help me understand, I said softly. For a moment I thought she might actually tell me. Her lips parted slightly, but then she shook her head. It doesn't matter anymore, she whispered. It matters to Daniel, I said. And it matters to that little boy who is going to grow up wondering why his mother walked away. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I didn't walk away, she said. Her voice cracked. I stepped back. That was when my suspicion turned into certainty. Because people who lie for selfish reasons don't talk like that. They defend themselves. They blame others. Emily wasn't doing either. She looked terrified. Emily, I said quietly, whose idea was this? Her head snapped up. What? The lie, I said. The one about Noah not being Daniel's. Her face went pale. No one's, she said quickly. But she didn't sound convincing. I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. You're protecting someone, I said. She looked away. The silence stretched between us. And suddenly a memory surfaced in my mind. Something small. Something I had dismissed weeks earlier. It had happened one evening when I stopped by Daniel's house unexpectedly. Emily had been in the kitchen feeding Noah. But she wasn't alone. My brother-in-law Michael, Daniel's uncle, had been standing by the window. They both looked startled when I walked in. At the time I had assumed it was nothing. Michael had always been close to our family. After my husband died years ago, he had helped Daniel fix up the house, taught him how to drive, even attended his graduation. But thinking back now, the tension in that room had felt strange, almost uncomfortable. I pushed the thought away quickly. That was ridiculous. Michael was family, and Emily was married to Daniel. The idea that anything inappropriate could exist between them felt impossible. Still, the unease lingered. Emily, I said slowly, did someone ask you to say that? Her eyes filled with tears again. She shook her head. No. But her voice trembled. And then she said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. If Daniel believes the baby isn't his, he'll be safe. I stared at her. Safe from what? Emily covered her mouth as if she had said too much. And suddenly I realized something that made my heart begin to pound. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. This was about a secret. A secret someone in our family was desperate to keep hidden. I stood up slowly. Emily, I said, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. Whatever you're protecting Daniel from, you don't have to do it alone. But she shook her head again. You don't understand, she whispered. If the truth comes out, it will destroy your family. I left her apartment that afternoon with more questions than answers. But one thing had become painfully clear. Emily wasn't the villain in this story. She was the shield. And somewhere inside our family, someone else was the truth she was trying to hide. The drive home from Emily's apartment felt longer than usual. The sky had cleared, but my thoughts were darker than they had been all morning. Every red light felt like an interruption to the questions spinning inside my mind. If Daniel believes the baby isn't his, he'll be safe. Emily's words echoed again and again. Safe from what? And more importantly, safe from who? By the time I reached my house, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned pale. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, a thought crept into my mind that I didn't want to entertain. What if the danger wasn't outside the family? What if it was inside it? When I walked into the house, Daniel was standing in the kitchen holding Noah. The baby was awake now, his small eyes blinking curiously at the world around him. Daniel looked exhausted, but when he saw me, he tried to smile. Hey, he said. How's my favorite boy? I asked softly, touching Noah's tiny hand. He cried most of the morning, Daniel said. I think he misses her. The words hung in the air. Even Daniel, who had been deeply hurt by Emily's confession, still spoke about her gently. That alone told me something about my son's heart. Babies know their mothers, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. Then he looked down at Noah again. I keep staring at him, he admitted, trying to figure out if I'm imagining things. What things? I asked carefully. He hesitated. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. I swear he looks like me. I let out a slow breath. You're not imagining it. Daniel looked up quickly. Mom. I've been thinking about that too, I said gently. And Emily's story doesn't make sense. Daniel stared at me. What do you mean? I pulled out a chair and sat down. I spoke to her today. His shoulders stiffened immediately. What did she say? Not much, I admitted. But enough. Daniel's jaw tightened. Did she tell you who the father is? No. His eyes darkened. Because there isn't one, he said bitterly. Or she would have said it. I watched him carefully. Daniel, do you remember anything strange during the last few months of her pregnancy? He frowned. Strange how? Anyone visiting more often, I said. Anyone she seemed uncomfortable around. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. Not really. But just as I was about to let the subject go, he hesitated. Well, maybe one thing. My heart skipped. What? He shifted Noah slightly in his arms. Uncle Michael came by a lot near the end, he said. The words landed like a stone in my chest. I forced myself to stay calm. Your uncle? Yeah, Daniel said. He said he just wanted to help out. Fix things around the house before the baby came. Michael had always been handy with tools. It wouldn't have been unusual for him to help. Except for the way Emily had reacted when I mentioned someone pressuring her. Did Emily ever seem uncomfortable when he was there? I asked. Daniel thought again. Now that you mention it. Yeah. How? She barely spoke, he said. I thought it was pregnancy hormones or something. He looked at me suddenly. Why are you asking about Michael? I hesitated. Because the truth was I didn't have proof of anything. Just a quiet, growing dread in my stomach. Just trying to understand the whole picture, I said gently. Daniel nodded slowly. But I could see the uncertainty forming in his eyes. Later that evening, after Daniel and the baby went home, I sat alone in my living room with an old photo album. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I turned the pages slowly. Pictures of Daniel growing up. Birthdays. School plays. Family gatherings. Eventually I reached the pages where Michael appeared more often. My late husband's younger brother. He had always been charming. The kind of man who could make people laugh within minutes of meeting them. But charm can be a dangerous thing. Because sometimes it hides things you'd rather not see. In one photograph, Michael had his arm around Daniel during Daniel's high school graduation. They looked almost like father and son. Michael had been proud of that role. He had told people many times that he helped raise the boy. At the time I had been grateful. Now, I felt something colder. Because if Michael had been around the house often while Emily was pregnant, that meant he had been alone with her too. The thought made my stomach twist. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Michael. He answered on the third ring. Well, hello, big sister, he said cheerfully. To what do I owe the pleasure? His voice sounded exactly the same as it always had. Relaxed. Friendly. Normal. I was wondering if you could stop by today, I said. There was a small pause. Everything okay? I just want to talk, I replied. Another pause. Then he said, sure. I'll come by this afternoon. When he arrived, he carried a box of pastries from the bakery down the street. Thought you might want something sweet, he said, setting the box on the table. I studied his face carefully. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. We sat down in the kitchen. Michael poured himself coffee like he had done 100 times before. So, he said casually, I heard about Daniel and Emily. My eyes narrowed slightly. You heard. Word travels, he shrugged. What do you think about it? I asked. He shook his head. Shame, really. Emily always seemed like such a nice girl. His tone was almost sympathetic. Almost. Did you know she said the baby isn't Daniel's? I asked. Michael raised his eyebrows. Is that right? But the surprise in his voice felt rehearsed. Carefully measured. Yes, I said. I watched his face closely. He sipped his coffee calmly. Well, he said after a moment, These things happen. The words made something inside me snap. These things happen? I repeated. He shrugged again. People make mistakes. I leaned forward slowly. Emily says Daniel is safer believing that lie. Michael froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because in that brief moment, the calm mask on his face cracked. And suddenly a terrible possibility formed in my mind. A possibility so disturbing that even thinking it made my heart pound. If Emily was lying to protect Daniel, and if Michael was acting like he already knew the truth, then there was only one explanation that made sense. One explanation that would destroy our family forever. The moment Michael's expression changed, I knew I had stepped onto something dangerous. It lasted only a second, that flicker in his eyes, but it was enough to confirm what my instincts had been whispering all day. He recovered quickly. Too quickly. Except for the way Emily had reacted when I mentioned someone pressuring her. Did Emily ever seem uncomfortable when he was there? I asked. Daniel thought again. Now that you mention it. Yeah. How? She barely spoke, he said. I thought it was pregnancy hormones or something. He looked at me suddenly. Why are you asking about Michael? I hesitated. Because the truth was I didn't have proof of anything. Just a quiet, growing dread in my stomach. Just trying to understand the whole picture, I said gently. Daniel nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty forming in his eyes. Later that evening, after Daniel and the baby went home, I sat alone in my living room with an old photo album. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I turned the pages slowly. Pictures of Daniel growing up. Birthdays. School plays. Family gatherings. Eventually I reached the pages where Michael appeared more often. My late husband's younger brother. He had always been charming. The kind of man who could make people laugh within minutes of meeting them. But charm can be a dangerous thing. Because sometimes it hides things you'd rather not see. In one photograph, Michael had his arm around Daniel during Daniel's high school graduation. They looked almost like father and son. Michael had been proud of that role. He had told people many times that he helped raise the boy. At the time I had been grateful. Now, I felt something colder. Because if Michael had been around the house often while Emily was pregnant, that meant he had been alone with her too. The thought made my stomach twist. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Michael. He answered on the third ring. Well, hello, big sister, he said cheerfully. To what do I owe the pleasure? His voice sounded exactly the same as it always had. Relaxed. Friendly. Normal. I was wondering if you could stop by today, I said. There was a small pause. Everything okay? I just want to talk, I replied. Another pause. Then he said, sure. I'll come by this afternoon. When he arrived, he carried a box of pastries from the bakery down the street. Thought you might want something sweet, he said, setting the box on the table. I studied his face carefully. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. We sat down in the kitchen. Michael poured himself coffee like he had done 100 times before. So, he said casually, I heard about Daniel and Emily. My eyes narrowed slightly. You heard. Word travels, he shrugged. What do you think about it? I asked. He shook his head. Shame, really. Emily always seemed like such a nice girl. His tone was almost sympathetic. Almost. Did you know she said the baby isn't Daniel's? I asked. Michael raised his eyebrows. Is that right? But the surprise in his voice felt rehearsed. Carefully measured. Yes, I said. I watched his face closely. He sipped his coffee calmly. Well, he said after a moment, these things happen. The words made something inside me snap. These things happen? I repeated. He shrugged again. People make mistakes. I leaned forward slowly. Emily says Daniel is safer believing that lie. Michael froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because in that brief moment, the calm mask on his face cracked. And suddenly a terrible possibility formed in my mind. A possibility so disturbing that even thinking it made my heart pound. If Emily was lying to protect Daniel, and if Michael was acting like he already knew the truth, then there was only one explanation that made sense. One explanation that would destroy our family forever. The moment Michael's expression changed, I knew I had stepped onto something dangerous. It lasted only a second, that flicker in his eyes, but it was enough to confirm what my instincts had been whispering all day. He recovered quickly. Too quickly. Well, he said with a small laugh, I'm sure Emily is just trying to avoid the mess of a divorce. But the ease in his voice felt forced now. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together on the table. Michael, I said calmly, how often were you visiting Daniel and Emily during the last few months of her pregnancy? He blinked once. Not that often. That's not what Daniel remembers. He shifted slightly in his seat. Well, you know how it is, he said. The house needed repairs. Daniel asked for help. That part was true. Daniel had mentioned that. But something about Michael's body language had changed. His shoulders were tighter now. His eyes no longer met mine directly. And I realized something then. He wasn't surprised by the questions. He was calculating them. You've always been close to Daniel, I continued. Of course, he said quickly. I practically helped raise him after your husband passed. Yes, I said quietly. You did. I let the silence stretch. Then I asked the question that had been growing heavier in my chest all morning. Were you ever alone with Emily? Michael laughed. Well, sure. Plenty of times. That's normal, isn't it? Maybe, I said slowly. But Emily told me something interesting yesterday. He didn't respond. She said Daniel is safer believing the baby isn't his. That tiny crack appeared again. This time he covered it by taking another sip of coffee. Women say strange things when they're stressed, he muttered. But now I was watching him the way a hunter watches movement in tall grass. Carefully. Patiently. Waiting. Michael, I said quietly, did something happen between you and Emily? His cup stopped halfway to the table. The room felt suddenly smaller. For a long moment neither of us moved. Then he laughed again, louder this time. Don't be ridiculous. I didn't smile. Because something about the way he said it sounded defensive. Not amused. Emily seems terrified, I continued. And people usually get terrified when someone has power over them. His eyes narrowed slightly. What exactly are you accusing me of? I'm asking a question. He leaned back in his chair. Well, here's my answer, he said coldly. You're looking for someone to blame because your son's marriage fell apart. The sharpness in his voice made my heart pound harder. But I refused to back down. Did you threaten her? His jaw tightened. Of course not. Did you pressure her to say the baby isn't Daniel's? That's insane. His tone was louder now. Angrier. And suddenly I noticed something strange. Michael's hands were shaking. Just slightly. But enough. A quiet realization settled over me like a slow-moving storm. People don't get that nervous unless they're afraid of something. Or someone finding out the truth. I stood up. I think you should go, I said calmly. Michael looked startled. That's it. For now. He pushed his chair back, clearly relieved. As he walked toward the door, he paused beside me. You know, he said quietly, sometimes people see problems where there aren't any. I looked at him steadily. And sometimes people hide them. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. And for the first time since this nightmare began, my hands began to tremble. Because deep down, I already knew what the truth was. I just hadn't allowed myself to say it out loud yet. That evening I drove back to Emily's apartment. The sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the parking lot. When she opened the door and saw me again, she looked startled. I told you, she said softly. There's nothing more to talk about. Yes, there is, I replied. She hesitated before stepping aside to let me in. We sat at the same kitchen table as the day before. Emily looked exhausted. I spoke to Michael today, I said. Her entire body went still. The reaction was instant and undeniable. Her eyes widened slightly before she looked down at her hands. Why? She whispered. Because something about your story doesn't add up. The silence that followed felt heavy. Then I said the words I had been afraid of all day. Did Michael threaten you? Emily's breath caught. For a moment she didn't move. Then tears began sliding slowly down her cheeks. I knew you'd figure it out eventually, she whispered. My heart sank. Emily, tell me the truth. She shook her head quickly. I can't. You have to. No, she said desperately. If I tell you, everything will fall apart. Everything already has, I said gently. She wiped her face with trembling hands. You don't understand what he's capable of. My chest tightened. What did he do? Emily stared at the table. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered the words that changed everything. It happened one night when Daniel was working late. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Emily's voice was barely audible now. He came over to fix the kitchen sink. My stomach turned. And then, she closed her eyes. I told him Daniel wasn't home. I said he could come back another time. Her hands trembled as she spoke. But he insisted. The air in the room felt suddenly too thin. What happened next? I asked softly. Her shoulders shook as she tried to speak. He said Daniel would never believe me, she whispered. The words hit me like ice water. And when I found out I was pregnant, he told me to keep quiet. My vision blurred for a moment, because suddenly every piece of the puzzle fell into place. Emily looked up at me with broken eyes. I told him I would tell Daniel everything, she said. And he said if I did, he would make sure Daniel never recovered from it. My heart pounded in my ears. What does that mean? He said the truth would destroy your family, she whispered. For a long moment I couldn't speak, because the possibility I had been afraid of had just become real. Emily wiped her tears again. That's why I told Daniel the baby wasn't his, she said quietly. I thought it would protect him. The words felt like knives in my chest, because if Emily was telling the truth, then the man I had trusted for years, the man who had helped raise my son, had done something unforgivable. And suddenly I realized something even worse. Michael didn't think anyone would believe Emily, but he had made one mistake. He had underestimated me. I reached across the table and took Emily's shaking hands. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, I said quietly. Her eyes widened with fear. What are you going to do? I looked at her steadily. The right thing. Because some secrets destroy families. But some truths need to be spoken before they destroy even more. When I left Emily's apartment that night, the air outside felt colder than it had before. The streetlights had already come on, and the parking lot was almost empty. For a moment I just stood beside my car, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From anger. A quiet, heavy anger that settled deep in my chest. Michael had been part of our family for nearly 20 years. After my husband died, he had stepped in during the hardest moments, fixing broken pipes, helping Daniel move into his first apartment, even sitting beside me during Daniel's college graduation. I had trusted him, and now I knew that trust had been a mask, because the truth Emily had whispered through tears was something far darker than a broken marriage. It was betrayal, the kind that stains everything it touches. But anger alone wouldn't help anyone, especially not Daniel, because Daniel still believed his wife had betrayed him. And if I marched into his house and told him the truth without proof, I could destroy him in ways I might never be able to repair. I needed certainty, not just suspicion. Proof. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing two different memories layered on top of each other. Michael laughing at family barbecues, and Emily sitting at that kitchen table whispering through tears. By morning I knew what I had to do. I drove to Daniel's house early. He opened the door still wearing yesterday's clothes. Noah balanced carefully in his arms. Mom, he said surprised. Everything okay? I forced a gentle smile. I thought you might need breakfast. I had brought a bag of fresh bagels and coffee from the bakery. Daniel stepped aside to let me in. The house looked even more tired than the day before. Bottles on the counter, a small pile of laundry near the couch, the quiet chaos of a newborn's presence. Daniel sat down while I unpacked the food. Noah made a small squeaking sound in his sleep. You're good with him, I said softly. Daniel looked down at the baby with a tired smile. He deserves someone who is. The sadness in his voice was sharp. Daniel, I said gently, do you still believe Emily? He didn't answer right away. Then he sighed. I don't know what to believe anymore. His eyes drifted back to the baby. Sometimes I look at him and I think he has my dad's eyes. That caught my attention. Your father's eyes? Daniel nodded slowly. The same shape. My heart squeezed painfully. Because Daniel's father had died when Daniel was just 8 years old. But I knew those eyes well. And Daniel was right. Noah had them. Daniel, I said carefully, has Emily ever lied to you before? He frowned. No. Not even once. He shook his head. That's why this makes no sense. I sat down across from him. What if she was lying, but not for the reason you think? Daniel looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, I said slowly. What if she was protecting someone? He blinked. Protecting who? I held his gaze for a long moment. You. The word hung in the air between us. Daniel stared at me like he didn't understand. Then he let out a short, tired laugh. Mom protecting me from what? That was the question I still didn't have a complete answer for. But I knew one thing. Michael had believed fear would keep Emily silent. And sometimes the fastest way to reveal the truth is to make the liar feel safe enough to talk. That afternoon I called Michael again. He answered almost immediately. Well, hello again, he said lightly. I was wondering if you could come by tonight, I told him. Everything all right? Yes, I said. I think we need to talk about Emily. There was a small pause. Then he said, sure. But Michael didn't know something important. Daniel would be there too. That evening, Daniel sat quietly in my living room while Noah slept in a portable crib beside the couch. He looked nervous. You're really not going to tell me what this is about? He asked. I will, I said gently. But first, I want you to listen. Daniel frowned slightly but nodded. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Michael standing there with the same relaxed smile he always wore. Evening, he said cheerfully. But when he stepped inside and saw Daniel sitting on the couch, the smile faded. Just slightly. Daniel, he said. Uncle Mike, Daniel replied. Michael glanced between us. Did I miss something? Sit down, I said calmly. He hesitated. But eventually he took the chair across from Daniel. The room felt tense now, like the air before a storm. I folded my hands together. Michael, I said quietly, Emily told me something yesterday. He leaned back casually. Oh, yes. I watched his face carefully. She said the baby isn't Daniel's. Michael nodded slowly. That's what everyone's saying. But she also said something else. His eyes flickered. What's that? I took a deep breath. She said she lied. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's head snapped toward me. What? But I kept my eyes on Michael. She said she lied because someone threatened her. Michael's expression didn't change. But his hands tightened slightly on his knees. That's a serious accusation, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. It is. Daniel looked back and forth between us, confusion spreading across his face. Mom, what's going on? I didn't answer him. Not yet. Because the truth needed to come from the person who had tried so hard to bury it. I leaned forward slightly. Michael, I said softly, would you like to tell Daniel the rest? For the first time since he arrived, Michael looked nervous. For a moment the entire room felt frozen. Michael didn't move. Daniel sat upright on the couch, his eyes darting between us, trying to make sense of something he clearly wasn't prepared to hear. And the baby, little Noah, shifted quietly in the crib beside the couch, letting out a soft sleepy sigh. It was such a small sound, but it reminded me exactly why we were here. Truth matters, especially when a child's life will grow around it. Michael cleared his throat. I don't know what kind of game this is, he said slowly, but I'm not playing it. Daniel frowned. What game? Michael looked at him with practiced calm. Your mother seems to think Emily's problems have something to do with me. Daniel blinked in confusion. What? I didn't speak yet. Because sometimes silence gives a liar enough space to reveal themselves. And Michael was already stepping deeper into his own trap. That's ridiculous, Michael continued, shaking his head. Emily cheated on you, Daniel. She panicked when the baby came and decided to blame someone else. Daniel's face tightened. The words clearly hurt him. But something in his expression had changed too. Because he had grown up with me. And he knew I didn't accuse people lightly. Mom? He asked quietly. I looked at him. Emily didn't cheat on you. Daniel stared at me. But she said. She lied, I said gently. The room went silent again. Then Daniel asked the question we had all been circling around. Why? Michael stood up suddenly. I think I've heard enough of this nonsense, he muttered. But before he could reach the door, I spoke again. She lied because you threatened her. The words landed like a heavy stone in the room. Michael stopped walking. Slowly he turned back around. That's a dangerous accusation, he said quietly. But now his voice carried a sharper edge. Daniel stood up too. What is she talking about? He asked. Michael forced a small laugh. Your mother's imagination is running wild. But Daniel didn't laugh. He was watching both of us carefully now. And I could see the fear beginning to creep into his eyes. Daniel, I said softly. I spoke to Emily yesterday. His entire body stiffened. What did she say? I took a slow breath. She said something happened while you were working late one night. Michael's jaw tightened. Don't, he said quietly. But I kept going. She said Michael came over to fix the kitchen sink. Daniel looked at his uncle. Michael didn't respond. She said he wouldn't leave, I continued. The room felt unbearably still now. And then Daniel whispered the words I had been dreading. Mom. I forced myself to meet his eyes. Emily says Michael assaulted her. The sound that came out of Daniel wasn't quite a word. It was more like the air being punched out of his lungs. He stared at Michael as if he had never seen him before. That's not true, Michael snapped immediately. His voice was louder now. Angrier. She's lying. But the calm confidence he had carried earlier was gone. Now there was panic creeping into the edges of his voice. Daniel turned slowly toward him. You're saying my wife made that up? Yes, Michael said quickly. Why would she do that? Daniel asked. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because suddenly the logic of his lie was collapsing. Why would she destroy her own marriage? Daniel continued quietly. Michael didn't answer. And why, Daniel said slowly, would she say the baby isn't mine? That question hung in the air. Michael's silence stretched too long. Daniel noticed. We both did. Answer me, Daniel said. His voice was shaking now. Michael's eyes flickered toward the door again. I don't have to answer anything, he muttered. But Daniel stepped forward. Yes, you do. Michael laughed nervously. You're really going to believe this ridiculous story? Daniel's hands were clenched into fists now. I want to hear you say it. Say what? That she's lying. Michael hesitated. And that hesitation was louder than any confession. Daniel took another step closer. Look at me, he said. Michael finally met his eyes. The room felt electric with tension. Tell me she's lying, Daniel repeated. Michael swallowed. For a moment I thought he might actually say it. But instead, he looked away. That was the moment everything broke. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, like something inside him had finally given way. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. Get out. Michael blinked. What? You heard me, Daniel said. Get out of my mother's house. Michael looked stunned. You're going to believe that story? Daniel didn't answer. He simply pointed toward the door. Michael looked at me next. For the first time since I had known him, there was no charm left in his face. Only anger. You'll regret this, he said quietly. But I didn't respond. Because threats only work when people are afraid. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Michael left the house without another word. The door closed behind him with a heavy click. And suddenly the room felt unbelievably quiet. Daniel stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the door. Then slowly, he sank down onto the couch. His hands covered his face. And for a long moment, the only sound in the room was his breathing. Mom, he whispered. I sat beside him. I'm here. His voice cracked. Why didn't she tell me? My heart ached hearing the question. Because she thought it would destroy you, I said gently. Daniel shook his head slowly. She thought lying would protect me. He let out a broken laugh. But all it did was destroy everything. From the crib beside the couch, Noah began to stir. Daniel looked over at him. Then he stood up and carefully lifted the baby into his arms. For a long time he just held him, studying his tiny face. And then he whispered something so softly I almost didn't hear it. "You are mine." The house felt different after Michael left. Quieter, but also heavier. Like a storm had passed through and left the air still trembling in its wake. Daniel stood by the window with Noah in his arms, rocking him gently without realizing it. The baby had fallen asleep again. His tiny fingers curled around the fabric of Daniel's shirt. For a long time neither of us spoke. Some silences are necessary. This was one of them. Eventually Daniel sat down again. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yes. Do you think it's true?" The question hurt more than I expected. Not because I doubted Emily, but because I knew what it meant for my son to ask it. He wasn't questioning her pain. He was trying to understand how someone he trusted could do something so terrible. "I believe her," I said softly. Daniel stared at the floor. Michael had been part of his life for almost 2 decades. When my husband died, Daniel had clung to his uncle during some of the hardest years of his childhood. They had built tree houses together, gone fishing, fixed broken bicycles in the garage. Now those memories had been poisoned by a truth none of us had been ready to face. Daniel rubbed his face with one hand. "I feel stupid," he muttered. "You're not stupid. I should have noticed something," he said. "Daniel, I should have protected her." His voice cracked on the last word. I reached over and placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "None of this is your fault." He shook his head. "But she went through all of that alone." I didn't have an easy answer for that. Because the truth was, Emily had been alone. For months. Carrying both a baby and a secret she was terrified to reveal. Daniel looked down at Noah again. The baby stretched slightly in his sleep. And something softened in Daniel's expression. "What if he grows up one day and asks where his mother is?" he asked quietly. The question lingered in the room. I took a slow breath. "Then you tell him the truth," I said. "Not the ugly parts right away, but the truth about who she is." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Tell him she's a woman who loved him enough to protect him," I said gently. "And when he's old enough to understand, tell him the rest." Daniel looked thoughtful. Then he nodded slowly. 2 days later, Daniel went to see Emily. I didn't go with him. That conversation belonged to them. But he called me afterward. And I will never forget the sound of his voice. It was softer than it had been in weeks. "Mom," he said. "Yes." She thought I'd hate her. My heart ached hearing that. "And do you?" "No," he said immediately. "I wish she had trusted me more. But I understand why she didn't." He paused. Then he added quietly. "She cried when she saw Noah again." I smiled softly. "That doesn't surprise me." Emily came back to Daniel's house the next day. Not to stay right away. Just to see the baby. Daniel told me she stood beside the crib for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word. Just watching Noah sleep. Eventually she whispered something. Daniel told me later what it was. "I'm sorry," she had said. Over and over again. Healing doesn't happen all at once. Slower than people think. There were still difficult conversations ahead. Legal ones. Emotional ones. Michael's actions would eventually reach authorities. And the truth would travel farther than our living room. But something important had already changed. The secret was no longer controlling everyone's lives. A few weeks later, Emily came to visit me. She looked different. Still fragile but lighter somehow. We sat at my kitchen table. The same place where everything had begun that rainy morning. I poured us both tea. For a moment we just sat quietly. Then Emily spoke. "I thought you would hate me." I shook my head gently. "No. I lied to your son," she whispered. "You tried to protect him. But I almost lost everything." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Sometimes people make impossible choices," I said softly. "And sometimes the bravest thing they can do is tell the truth afterward." Emily wiped her eyes. "Daniel says he wants to try again." "That's good. But I told him it might take time." "That's wise." She nodded slowly. Then she said something that stayed with me. I don't want Noah growing up around secrets. Neither did I. Months passed. Slowly, life found a new rhythm. Daniel and Emily began rebuilding their relationship piece by piece. Some days were harder than others. But there were good moments too. Small ones. The kind that matter. Like the afternoon I visited and found them both sitting on the floor laughing while Noah tried to crawl toward the family dog. Or the evening Daniel proudly told me Noah had said his first word. Dad. Daniel had looked like the happiest man alive. Watching them heal reminded me of something important. Families don't break only from betrayal. Sometimes they break from silence. And sometimes, they heal because someone finally has the courage to speak. Sitting here watching Noah crawl across the floor and Daniel and Emily laughing together, I can't help but think about how fragile life can be. One secret, one choice to stay silent. It almost destroyed an entire family. Sometimes we protect people by hiding the truth. Sometimes we think silence is kindness. But the truth has a weight that won't disappear. It waits. It grows. And eventually it finds its way out. Emily made a terrifying choice to lie about something so personal, because she wanted to protect Daniel from heartbreak. Michael abused that trust. He tried to control the story and the people around him. But love and honesty have a power that fear cannot stop. I've learned that protecting someone doesn't always mean keeping secrets. Sometimes it means standing up for them, even when it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it means listening to their fear and guiding them gently toward the courage to speak. And in the end, healing comes slowly, but it comes. Families can be rebuilt. Trust can grow again. And children like Noah can grow up in a home where the truth is not hidden, where love is stronger than any lie. So, I leave you with this question. If you were in my shoes, would you have confronted the secret as I did? Or would you have let it linger, hoping it would somehow disappear? Truth is messy. Love is messy. But in the quiet, when the storm has passed, we find clarity. We find peace. And maybe, just maybe, we find each other again. If you felt the weight of family secrets or witnessed the power of speaking the truth, I'd love for you to share your story in the comments. And if you want more real-life stories like this, ones that explore betrayal, love, and redemption, please subscribe and support the channel, because every story has a lesson, and every lesson is worth hearing.